I have benefited from a repurposed drug, and so I'm really happy to be here today. I want to first give you a bit of history about my disease and about the drug that has been repurposed for it, because I think it's useful to have that background before I launch into my personal story. So I have LAM, which is short for lymphangioliomyomatosis. And LAM affects the lungs, where LAM cells create cysts that block the airways. It often affects the kidneys, where kind of tumor-like masses grow. And it can also have lymphatic complications. LAM is found almost exclusively in women. And it's typically diagnosed during a woman's childbearing years. Sporadic LAM, which is what I have, is very rare. It occurs in about 5 in every million women. And that is contrasted with LAM, which occurs as a feature of the tuberous sclerosis complex. And there about 20 to maybe even 40% of women with TSC also have LAM. And as I'll mention in a minute, the learning in TSC has actually been really helpful in learning about LAM. LAM is a progressive disease, but the rate at which it progresses varies quite significantly from woman to woman. Before the repurposed drug, some women declined very quickly and would need a lung transplant in order to live. Other women might have, live moderately well for maybe 20 or so years after their diagnosis. Now, unfortunately, the drug is not effective for all women. And so some still do face that range of consequences, and sadly, some women do still die from LAM. Now, there isn't a cure, but the drug Rapamycin has been repurposed to treat it. And I think sirolimus has been discussed today, and that's another name for Rapamycin. It also goes by Rapamycin. For about 2/3 of the women who take Rapamycin, the drug slows the progression of their disease. But unfortunately, even for those women for whom it's working, we have to continue taking it because when we stop, the disease ramps up again. Now, Rapamycin's journey to become the treatment for LAM, I think involved a lot of serendipity, hard work and dedication of clinicians and researchers, and significant patient involvement, as well as help from the drug's manufacturer. Now, I don't plan to go into all the details on this slide, and with apologies to doctors and scientists in the room. As I mentioned, a lot of you probably do know what sirolimus is. But basically, it went from being discovered in a soil sample in 1972 to being an approved immunosuppressant about 20 years ago for use in patients who had just had organ transplants to prevent organ rejection. Now, obviously, the initial focus had been on that immunosuppressant effect, but in the 90s and into the 2000s, researchers were looking at other important potential uses of the drug. And during that same period, through efforts of researchers who were studying TSC and LAM, and in completely independent efforts of scientists who were studying proteins in fruit flies, scientists were able to confirm the role of TSC genes in cell growth and proliferation, and that a mutation in those genes allows LAM cells to grow and spread. And that led scientists to look at something that would put a brake on that cell growth, and that led them to look to Rapamycin, which by that point in the early 2000s, scientists had realized can help regulate cell growth. So drug trials that focused on using Rapamycin for LAM started in 2004. There was a very small trial conducted in the US that showed that the tumor size in TSC and LAM patients who had these kidney tumors, that reduced. There was also a very small drug trial here in the UK that showed that Rapamycin could be a safe and effective treatment. Around the same time of the Nottingham tests, there was a clinical trial, a much larger trial of 89 women that started in the US called the MILES trial, and that was also conducted in Japan and Canada. It was a 2-year trial. The entire process, it took 7 years from protocol drafting to publication of the conclusions in 2011. Now, Pfizer manufactures rapamycin, and it had supported the MILES trial. It contributed $1 million of the drug, and I think $200,000 just in research support. But it didn't want to go through the process of seeking regulatory approval once that it had been established that it was effective for LAM. And that was partly because the drug was commercially available, but also partly because of the limited market potential, i.e. the small patient population. So thankfully, a somewhat novel and a real streamlined regulatory pathway was agreed between Pfizer, the researchers, and the US FDA. And rapamycin was approved in the US in 2015 for LAM treatment, and it has since been approved by the European Medicines Agency and in countries around the world. Now, I will add that there were at the time, and there remain, some lingering concerns about the safety of the long-term use of rapamycin, and so it's generally recommended only for women whose LAM has, caused a significant deterioration in their lung function, or whose LAM is especially aggressive or problematic. Now, very briefly, rapamycin, it's not obviously the only drug that's been considered for repurposing, and there were 2 tests done here in the UK on potential other treatments, amongst tests that have been going on elsewhere. Because LAM affects only women, it's been assumed that there must be an estrogen connection. And as a result, women were commonly given anti-estrogen treatments. And a UK trial showed that anti-estrogens probably did not have a significant effect. A Nottingham research team had also conducted a 2-year trial of the antibiotic doxycycline, which some people thought could be effective. And that trial, again, showed that that drug didn't work. And so while neither of those studies had a positive outcome in terms of the drug, I think they were very worthwhile to do because women no longer are given those ineffective treatments. Now, it's doubtful whether a lot of the research on LAM would have been done were it not for patient organizations. And in the US, the LAM Foundation was formed in 1995 by Sue Burns, who's the mother of a young woman who was diagnosed with LAM and who saw how little there was available to help her daughter. Independent of that, around the same time, in the mid-90s, a group was forming in the UK that's now become known as LAM Action. And that was largely due to Professor Ann Tattersfield, who was a respiratory specialist in Nottingham, who happened to be treating several women with LAM. And she saw the need those women had to talk to one another, to find somebody else who had their condition. The LAM Foundation and LAM Action, as well as the TSC Alliance, have really been fundamental in raising funds for research and in liaising with and in organizing patients to participate in clinical trials. So with all that background, what is my patient's perspective? Well, I was diagnosed with LAM in 1996, before most of that research, those breakthroughs I just described. And at that time, I was told that I had less than 10 years to live. So I expected to lose my lung function over a pretty short period of time and to be in desperate need for a lung transplant. At the time of my diagnosis, I was living in New York, and thankfully the LAM Foundation had just started. And through them, I found a LAM specialist, and eventually I heard about a research program that was just starting up at the US National Institutes of Health. So the purpose of that study, it was to learn more about the biology of LAM rather than to come up with a drug specifically. But I enrolled in that study. And I did so because it was the only thing that I could do about the fact I had LAM. And I didn't expect to benefit from a treatment because I know that research, it lasts a lifetime. But participating in that study made me feel like I had a little bit of power over the disease. So believe it or not, the NIH study is still ongoing, and I still participate. So I visit the NIH once a year and spend a few days in hospital there. Now, during my very first visit, the doctor suggested that I take anti-estrogen medicine. And this was in 1998, before the UK study had shown that that was not an effective treatment. And so I did that, and I was on that drug for about 4 years with no positive outcome. Within a few years of being diagnosed, doctors had learned enough about LAM to understand that it was more variable than they had previously thought. And so they actually upgraded my prognosis to 20 years, which was good, but still not quite enough time. And there was still no drug that was available. So I moved to the UK in 2000, and through a very small but amazing network of LAM specialists, I found a doctor here. And I also learned about the UK patient group, LAM Action. And eventually I became involved in LAM Action and have been a trustee since 2007. Now, through my years of participating in research at the NIH and being heavily involved in LAM Action, I consider myself a pretty well-informed and sensible LAM patient. So it might surprise you, and I am embarrassed to admit, that when I was told in 2012 that my LAM had progressed to the point that I needed to start taking this drug, I did not start taking it. Instead, I spent a year in denial that my LAM had got to that point. I said, oh, my lung function's down because I'm not being fit, I'm not going to the gym enough. I probably came up with other excuses too. In any event, my lung function continued to decline, and the following year had my lung function tests, a sharp decline at that point, and the doctor said, you really need to start taking the drug. And at that point, I didn't argue, because I could feel, the change in my condition at that point. And I know that had I not had access to the drug then, I would have felt devastated. Seeing my lung function really sharply declining at that point would have been very frightening. But instead, I knew there was this drug that I could take, and I might be able to stop the disease from getting worse. So I've been on Rapamycin for 7 years now. And although my lung function does continue to go down, it is at a much slower pace. About a year ago, I was told to start using oxygen when I exercise. And I'm confident that without the drug, my need for oxygen would have come sooner, and it would probably be more all-encompassing at this point. These days, I actually find myself thinking and talking about getting old, which is just something I never thought I couldn't dream of 20 years ago. Now, my story represents one end of the spectrum. I'm fortunate that my LAM progressed at a slow to moderate pace. And I'm fortunate that at the time I needed it, there was a drug that had already gone through its clinical trials and was being recommended for my condition. But I want to share with you the story of another woman with LAM who kind of represents the other end of that spectrum, but who couldn't be here today. So Javi Carroll is a professor of philosophy at the University of Bristol. She was diagnosed with LAM in 2006 when she was 35. An otherwise healthy woman with an active career, she had become increasingly breathless for a couple of years before her diagnosis. She also chalked that up to a lack of fitness. Maybe it's a woman thing. We think it's our fault. But anyway, Javi's LAM was particularly aggressive, and her lung function was declining rapidly. Within 6 months of her diagnosis, she was put on oxygen and referred for a transplant assessment. Like I had been, Javi was told that she had less than 10 years to live, but in her case, it could very well have been true. Now, at the time of Javi's diagnosis in 2006, it was the early days of research. Clinical trials were still in process. There were significant concerns about the drug's safety long term. One doctor even said that using rapamycin to treat LAM was like using a blowtorch to kill a mosquito. So because of that uncertainty, Javi's LAM consultant was reluctant to give her rapamycin. There just wasn't enough solid science yet. From Javi's perspective, taking a drug around which there was some risk was a better option than doing nothing and deteriorating to the point that she needed a lung transplant to live. She asked to be put on rapamycin, but instead at that point in 2006, she was put on doxycycline. And this was prior to the UK trial that showed that that drug was not effective. So Javi's condition was so precarious that she was having quarterly lung function tests, and they continued to show this rapid decline. And so in 2007, about a year after her diagnosis, she was put on rapamycin. And this was, again, before the clinical trials had finished. Javi believes that her doctor would have liked to have had more certainty, that the drug was safe. But she also believes that given how quickly her LAM was progressing and the lack of other options, her doctor recognized that Javi was at risk of losing most, if not all, of what she had wanted in life and what she'd hoped to achieve as her lung function deteriorated. So since 2007, when she started rapamycin off-label, Javi's lung function has been relatively stable. And I think it's fair to say that during the last 12 years, Javi has embraced the time and the reasonable good health that the drug has given her. Amongst other things, she and her husband have become parents to 2 boys. She's received 2 fellowships. She's lectured on illness and health extensively to philosophy students as well as to medical students in the medical profession. And Javi's also written 3 books, including the book Illness, which was shortlisted for a 2009 Wellcome Trust Book Prize. And I do want to recommend that book actually to you. The 3rd edition is recently published, and it includes a chapter on organ transplantation. But generally the book, it kind of weaves together Javi's personal experience of illness with her work and views as a philosopher. And it's a beautifully written book, but it also, I think, really does, provoke some thoughts about how we approach illness and treatment, not just in society, but in the medical profession as well. Now, Javi wishes that she could have started rapamycin a year earlier because during that year from diagnosis, her lung function dropped so significantly. She appreciates that there wasn't a lot of evidence on the drug, and she doesn't blame her doctors, but she does suggest that we might need to kind of rethink how we approach drug repurposing. Particularly from her perspective, there's too much concern about side effects when a disease is so aggressive and there's no alternative. Now, as I mentioned, I'm involved in LAM Action, and we are the charity that provides support to women in the UK with LAM, and we also fund research into the disease. And through that work, I've been able to see how other women are affected by their diagnosis or by the news that their LAM has progressed to the point where they need to start taking the drug. There is a stark difference between getting that news today versus 20 years ago and even 10 years ago. Even though rapamycin, it doesn't help everyone with LAM, the fact that doctors can offer women just the realistic hope of a drug, of an effective treatment, makes the news of diagnosis or disease progression just much easier to bear. In addition to the drug, we're also able to tell people these days about specialist clinics. There's a clinic in Nottingham, they're in 20 countries around the world, and I personally don't know how many of those would exist if it weren't for the drug treatment. Now, I recognize that amongst rare disease, LAM is fairly unique in terms of how much has been learned about the disease in a relatively short period of time. But some of the factors that have contributed to my good fortune, I think apply in most rare disease contexts. And the first is that patients with rare disease are often willing to put themselves at risk. You know, whether it's going through discomfort of research or clinical trials, the uncertainties that go along with all that, or whether it's to put themselves at risk by taking a drug that, you know, lacks scientific certainty if there's no alternative. The second is that it might be desirable to look at patients a bit more holistically, and I use that word for lack of a better one. You know, as Javi's doctor did when he decided to put her on the drug. You know, at what stage is the patient in her life? And how quickly is her disease progressing? And what will be the cost to her if treatment is delayed? And along that risk continuum, you know, we might want to tilt it a little bit more toward the risk rather than wait for more certainty, you know, especially in cases where the disease is progressing rapidly and there's no other option available. And third, it's incredibly important, and I think others have mentioned this today, you know, patients with rare disease need to engage with one another, and researchers and patient groups need to be joined up in studying rare disease. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.